Hello, thank you for joining us here today at AIPH's Green City Briefing, Flourishing Urban Design with Plants. I'm Francesca Boyd and I'm part of the Green City team here at AIPH. Green City projects come in all shapes and sizes, but they all have one thing in common, the incredible power of plants to transform spaces and lives. Throughout this 2024-25 briefing series, we will hear from experts and those putting into practice the incredible difference that plants can make to our urban environments. Before we delve into the topic, please could I take the opportunity to remind you of how today's webinar is going to run. First, I will introduce the MC, and this will be followed by our first speaker, after which we have our second speaker, followed by the move to a discussion section. This point is your opportunity to ask questions and to contribute to the discussion. So as the presentations progress, please do add your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Worshipful Company of Gardeners for their continued support of the AIPH Green City Briefings programme. Do take time to find out more about this unique organisation, including by viewing our earlier briefing series, which featured the work of the company based in London. And finally, stay up to date with the latest news, projects, research and initiatives from around the world with the AIPH Green City Global Update. The May issue will be released next week, so sign up now to make sure you don't miss it. Now, without further delay, please may I introduce our MC for today's webinar. Jane Welsh is the International Federation of Landscape Architects Special Envoy to AIPH and the co-chair of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects Committee on Climate Adaptation. Jane is currently the project manager of the Environmental Planning Unit at Toronto City Planning, leading the team responsible for creating new innovative solutions to address climate change adaptation and mitigation, natural heritage protection and biodiversity loss, and change the way Canada's largest city is built. Her work includes development and ongoing implementation of many firsts, including the Toronto Green Standard, Green Roof Bylaw, bird-friendly guidelines, which I actually read recently and are excellent, Ravine Protection Bylaw, and Toronto's Ravine and Biodiversity Strategy. Jane holds a degree in landscape architecture and a master's in planning. Thank you so much for being our MC today, Jane. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Frances. It's just wonderful to be here and welcome everybody. So this session is about the importance of plants in the urban environment, how they bring much needed beauty and respite into our cities, and also address the climate and biodiversity crisis by cooling the air, reducing urban heat island effect, absorbing rainfall, and restoring habitat. And as Frances said, I'm the special envoy to AIPH for the International Federation of Landscape Architects. And landscape architecture is a profession that plans, designs, and manages natural and built environments, and in so doing deals with adaptation and mitigation related to climate change and the stability of ecosystems. And the IFLA World Council is the global voice of landscape architects. It's comprised of 80 National Association members from 5 world regions: Europe, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas, and I belong to the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects. IFLA has been working hard to establish partnership and MOUs with allied international organizations such as AIPH, who are also working on ecosystem sustainability, biodiversity, human health, green global cities, cultural landscapes, and many other critical issues. The IFLA World Congress, Code Red for Earth, will be held in Istanbul the first week in September. The Congress calls for humankind to take urgent action to prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So Toronto, where I live and work, is a rapidly growing city with extremes of temperature between the winter and summer. The careful selection of plant material is incredibly important to a healthy landscape. Performance measures for new developments specify that plant material be regionally sourced for projects next to natural heritage areas and require a percentage of native species for every project. And in Toronto, all large new developments are required to construct a green roof, and plant selection for survivability on these roofs can be very challenging. And also for our streetscape in the public realm. And finally, I wanted to share that although we are a winter city, we find time to bring plants into our world through events at our botanical gardens and greenhouses, including this recent long winter event, Experimental Joy, at our Allen Gardens in Toronto. And now I get to stop sharing. There we go. And introduce our first guest speaker, which I'm very delighted to do so. So Elisa Olivares is a lecturer in planting design in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Sheffield. Her research interests include targeting new species for green roofs and designing plant communities for semi-arid urban areas. Currently, she is working on a design exchange partnership program grant from the AIPH on curated landscapes to incentivize care for the landscape. Elisa will be presenting on her research regarding plants for biodiversity in central Mexico City. So I'll turn it over to you, Elisa.
Hi, Jane. Thank you very much for presenting me, and thank you for doing a presentation of what is landscape architecture, which sometimes is not everybody knows, and it's an amazing career. So if you're thinking about changing career, it's amazing. Try it. So I'm going to share my presentation with you. Please let me know if you can see it.
Yes, all correct. Thank you.
Thank you. And so what I'm going to talk is about a project that I did some years ago in Mexico, but I think it's quite good for this event because I'm going to talk about plants for urban places in a country where we have an amazing biodiversity, but where we don't have enough plants produced for putting them for buying and for landscape architects and gardeners to put on our urban sites. So the aim of this project was to design a plant community for urban areas of low maintenance, especially for public areas in central Mexico. And the objectives were to identify the best species according to maintenance requirement, bigger species susceptibility to abiotic and biotic stress. And I will talk this very briefly because obviously it's 15 minutes, but bear with me. But as well, I want to do assess the performance of the community. Now, this was a screening, was not a particular experiment, because it was to see which plants will grow good and then do experiment after that. The plant selection criteria was the geographic distribution of the plants, the habitat, tropical deciduous forest, oak pine forest, grasslands that are around central Mexico. The wildlife associations that were known, life strategy, stress tolerant, competitive, and wood rules. The life cycles, they were all perennials. And what was the growth from ground cover, geophytes, grass, emergence, flower months, and flower color. Now, these are some of the species. Now, you might say, when I show you the list of species, you might say, well, we found lots of the species in the United States, we found lots of the species in the UK sale in nurseries, but in Mexico, it's very difficult to find native species in nurseries. So, for example, these 4 bulbs are amazingly beautiful. We have lots of species of this genera of Emerocallis, Brocalia, Tigridia, Saphirantes, but we don't have them for sale. So if you're a landscape architect and you want to work with geophytes, you can't find them. You can access them through different institutes that work with them and they start propagating them, but nurseries do not provide them. And that is a pity because we have amazing species that we can't use. Then we have lots of species of unknown. There are lots of species of Asclepias, and here I put a red flag that I'll come back. Tagetes as well is a genus that has several species in Mexico. Dahlia were a center of distribution, but it's difficult to find these species. So this is a little bit of the phenology that I saw during the experiment. Now, the experiment was done in the city of Cuernavaca, and in that city we have a particular dry season and a wet season. So the dry season starts around October and finishes at the end of May. And from the end of May to late September, we have some rain that is like all the precipitation that comes in the UK in 1 year, we have it in those months. So our dry season is very dry. So we need species that will be able to cope with those very drastic changes of precipitation. So this is how, for example, the plants were in green or establishing. this was just a year, this screening. This is where they're flowering. And here, the black ones is like a biotic stress that I found. And sometimes the plants rebound, like you see in Onotera kuntiana or speciosa or Salvia coccinea, and they even flower, and sometimes they just die. So this is a little bit of how the community looked in August. I was having a very high density of species because I wanted to later recreate these with seeds. But at that moment, obviously not the bulbs, not the geophytes, but the herbaceous perennials. So this was in August, and this is how it looked. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how the species were looking. So I had some very vigorous competitive species like Asclepias curasavica, Tagetes lucida, Brucella quesetiformis. They was very vigorous, but and then they needed to be caught several times. So they were really strong. They were flowering really beautiful, but in terms of having low maintenance, once the rain started, they would provide so much biomass that it would not be a low maintenance plant. Now, species with high number of visitors, for example, Asclepias curasavica, but these species and all other Asclepias species are becoming problematic because they can carry the OE disease for the monarch butterflies. Now, this happens because lots of these species that just grows in South United States and Central America started to be grown on northern United States, and is a species that it doesn't go dormant. So lots of butterflies stop the migration route because they could still have nectar from this flower or lay eggs. This creates lots of problems, but this is something, for example, that we as people that is working on landscape, that are producing plants, we need to know these things. At the moment, I didn't know that was happening, and it's a shame because it's a plant that is visited by lots of pollinators. Birds love the seeds to create nests. So is things that we have to tell the public that, you know, can we use them, can we not? Species tolerant to leafcutter ants. Where I live in Cuernavaca at that moment, we have lots of leafcutter ants, and it can become a problem because they eat everything. So you want species, and you don't want to kill the nest, the ant. So what can we do? We need to try species that will be resilient, that maybe they get cut off, that all the leaves are lost, but they come back. So Salvia coccinea coming back and flowering. Tagetes lucida or Tagetes lucida was repelled because it has a pungent odor. Geophytes were not touched. So we have to find species for different cases and see how we can work around pests and disease. But some species, for example, they wouldn't recover, so we just don't. Why we use them? Let's just not use them and use the ones that we can use. Then I tried to look at species with high ornamental impact, that few species of them will bring a lot of color, and that happened with all the geophytes, the dahlia, agastaches as well, and Roselia. Now, after that, I have a case study in Puebla. Sorry, I missed the letter. And this is what happened from research practice. When I did a plant palette for the city of Puebla, that's central Mexico as well. It was for our university, and they wanted to have the planters with the council and have something that would attract pollinators. So I did a plant palette based on some of the species of that research and another ones. But then I found the same problem. I couldn't, in this case, rely on me collecting seeds because the project was happening from 1 month to the other, and there were not enough nurseries for me to buy trees, bulbs, or herbaceous perennials. So grasses, it was a problem. So here I have a very reduced palette of what I did. Some of the non-native were Lantana montevidensis, for example, from South America, and Festuca glauca from the UK, Europe, because in Mexico we don't have enough grasses, native grasses to use. Right now we have more Stepa tenuissima. Here in the UK you find galore everywhere, but in Mexico, even if it's a native species, it's very difficult to find nurseries selling it. So that tells you that there's a lot of work trying to work with very simple, very common native species in some countries that they even grow, in the verges spontaneously, but that we cannot buy them in nurseries. Now, what happened, as I was saying, the main issues in practice was the low availability of native herbaceous species, very low availability of native grasses. Geophytes will only be able to find through institutions. In this case, the UBAEP, this university that I work with, they have a center, so they donated the bulbs to put in outside the university. And another problem is the resistance of gardeners in Mexico to do different designs and to work with different maintenance. In Mexico, for example, we like to do design that is very formal, and if it goes a little bit out of the formal, it's very difficult to train people and to know how to maintain. So these tell us that when we are producing plants, we don't not only want to produce more and better quality and know what they're good for in terms of pest and disease, what they're resistant to what, but how we are gonna work with the whole system, how is that going to be taken care of, and how we're going to do the maintenance. So out of these problems, I was thinking, well, we need information, because we can't have all this amazing biodiversity and not being able to use it because there's no enough information. So I came up with the idea to make a very accessible book that could be very tiny, but very informative about, and like a door, like a window for resources and for people to start looking where to find species, information about the species. And the book is in Spanish because most of the literature that we found collated in books are in English, so in Spanish. And for Mexico, Latin America, we have almost nothing published. It was for general public, so even if it has scientific information, it would be accessible. Multidisciplinary collaboration, so I was able to have collaborations from lots of different people working in different areas. So we have people working with green infrastructure, people talking about design, practitioners, people talking about perception studies, people talking more about production of plants, and botanic gardens, people are doing research about biodiversity. So it would bring this wide palette of experts talking in a very simple way for the producer that has, a little nursery in the backyard to big producers. The information of native plants and associated wildlife based on case studies, and that was really amazing work done by one of the botanic gardens, and I'm going to show it to you. As well, we talk a little bit about introduction to planting design. Now, bear in mind, this is introductory book, so everything is just a gateway, and from seed collection to propagation. So these are some of the tables that we did with the Botanic Garden Francisco Peláez. This garden is in Botanic Garden is in Puebla, in the town of Cholula. It's a town that has been having very rapid change of land use, and we're losing a lot of the plants and all the wildlife associated with them. So they've been doing amazing work, doing herbarium collections, seed collections, and teaching people how to use these plants from seed to ingestion and how they can be used. So they did this. They have a bird garden, and where they put plants associated with the birds, and they observe which birds were coming. So with lots of tables with different species of birds, and at what stage do they come, if they use the plant for food, or if they use it as a shelter, if they use it for perching, nectar, which kind of fruit, or for nesting. We did the same with the case study of the butterfly garden that they have, and linking the different butterflies that they look. Now, because this is a book for central Mexico, lots of the distribution of species, either plants or animals, invertebrates and birds, they're kind of the similar. There are variations, obviously, and depending on altitude, but around 1,500 to 2,500 meters is kind of the same. We share lots of the same species. So this is quite good for Puebla, Mexico City, Cuernavaca, state of Mexico. So this is some of the examples of the butterfly table. Sorry that this got pixelated. And this is just in general pollinators as well. So here you have if they use the plant for the butterfly or for the eggs. And then this is another one that I want to focus is the Center of Investigation of Native Plants, that they did a chapter talking about how you collect seed with licenses, you know, in a good way. And it's just to give a protocol of what a good practice and what is not. And where you cannot just go and take plants from the wild. You need to really have a protocol, follow certain steps and do it following the rules. And then how can you start propagating vegetatively and sexually inside your nurseries, and you know how you can start distributing these plants. So basically this is what I wanted to share with you. It's a little bit of what we did in Mexico, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elisa. That was quite fascinating, and I love the book that you've produced because half of it is educating and building capacity for people around the changes. So I'm delighted now to introduce to you our second speaker, who is Kathryn Deery, and she serves as the head horticulturist of Lurie Garden and is passionate about the vital role public gardens play in communities. Her goal is to maintain the design integrity of Lurie Garden while facilitating the garden's evolution. She aims to prioritize both the beauty and ecological function of Lurie Garden while maintaining a high standard of horticulture. Kathryn previously held positions in horticulture and public programming at the Chicago Botanic Garden. Additionally, she worked in habitat restoration with the Golden Gate Parks Conservancy and served as a Conservation Corps North Bay AmeriCorps member. Kathryn earned her Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science from the University of Michigan. So Kathryn's talk today will be about the four-season garden. I'll turn it over to you, Kathryn.
Thank you, Jane, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So I wanted to talk to everyone today about Lurie Garden, and I'm going to just start with a bit of an introduction of where this garden is located. It's in the middle of downtown Chicago, Illinois, in the United States, and you can see there by the star. It's in the center of the business district, so a very high use area. This site was actually previously the lakeshore line came all the way up to that star, and it was a marshy kind of landscape, and then it was filled in. Railroad tracks were placed there, and then eventually it was a parking lot. And then finally in 2004, Millennium Park opened, and this is a large urban park free to all. And within the park is Lurie Garden, which I care for. So this garden in total is about 5 acres, and there were a number of very important designers involved in the project, or well, important to me anyways. So the landscape architecture firm GGN, they are based in Seattle. Robert Israel did the lighting design, Pete Oudolf did the perennial design, and Jacqueline Vanderkloot did the bulb design. Within this space, we have over 340 different types of plants, species, cultivars, varieties. And we really see this space as a designed and curated public garden that is a living work of art and is another art piece within a park full of sculptures and artwork. So just to note, this is a completely built environment. It's a green roof. It sits on top of a parking structure. So our soil depth is a max of 4 feet with mature trees and the mix of perennials in there. And one key thing I think for the success of this garden is that the landscape architects and the designers have stayed involved in the project and regularly return and consult and work with the horticulturists on the evolution of the design. So that has been a key to the success of this garden. Something I want to emphasize today is that I really see the role of Lurie Garden as an example to the public, to what they can do in their own space, whether they have containers on their balcony or a small yard in the back of their duplex in the middle of downtown. We want to offer people inspiration, education, and just really share our knowledge with the people. The public perception, though, often of a naturalistic garden such as Lurie Garden is that it's messy, but we really see it as a beautiful mess or a curated mess. It is a naturalistic garden. We often get people also asking, oh, is this an all native garden or a pollinator garden? But really, it's a mix of both native to North America species in addition to non-native ornamental plants. And we find that we're sitting in a position where we can help people learn to add native plants to their gardens and use them in a thoughtful, designed way and blend them with some of their favorite ornamental plants that they've been using for years and years. So collectively, the garden is a mix of both long-lived perennials as well as short-lived species, and each plant that is introduced into the garden is looked at from its whole life cycle. And this is really key to Pete Outolf's design style, is he is interested in a plant from the beginning to the end. How does it look when it emerges from the garden? And how does it look as it senesces back and dies back for the winter? So here I'm just showing a few examples where we've successfully combined both native and non-native plants together, and how we can share this with visitors where they don't have to give up those plants that they've been using for years and years, but they can bring in successful native plants that are good for both the ecology of the garden and also provide beauty and fill a design aesthetic. One reason I believe that we are able to successfully put these plants on display is due to the design of Lurie Garden as a whole. You can see surrounding the garden there is a massive hedge that's made up of Carpinus, Fagus, and Thuya. And while this is a very resource-intensive feature, it is seen as a living green sculpture, and it provides a framework for the garden. It puts the perennials on a stage of sorts, and it provides this clean background so that when people enter through all of those narrow pathways, they're entering a whole other world, and they're really not expecting what they're about to see, because as you notice, just north of the garden is an event space where large events, concerts, and performances are held throughout the summer. So the hedge provides protection of the garden, but also really, I think, sets the gardens on a stage. The other reason I think that Lurie Garden is very successful in how we try to show people how they can manage in their garden is the use of different planting styles. So we have plants that are in blocks, which provides simple repetition. It's visually restful for people and can be seen as easier management. We are also shifting away from this term of maintenance because it implies that a garden is stagnant and we're maintaining it in one place in time. But we see our job as managing the garden and guiding its evolution. So some successful plants that we have in Lurie Garden that are in block form are Pycnanthemum muticum, blunt mountain mint. This is a native to this area plant. And the reason it's in a block is because that's what its habit wants to do. It spreads rhizomatously. If you were to try to interplant it, it would swallow up those other species. But a really beautiful native plant, attracts a ton of insects, has a soft kind of blue color, blooms for a long time, providing long season interest. We have a few different species and varieties of Amsonia throughout the garden. This is another successful block planting. I point to this plant a lot when I'm engaging with visitors because it helps make the design feel more legible, and it helps people kind of understand and gives them a moment of peacefulness so that they can take in the details of the more kind of finely detailed plants that are surrounding the Amsonia. And this is also a good example of a plant that provides multi-season interest, which is very important in our climate where we have, a brief spring, a brief fall, a decent summer, and a long winter, but beautiful fall color you can see there. I wanted to talk about the Salvia River. This is one of our kind of known features of the garden, and this is what it looked like long ago when the garden was first planted. And part of my job is to help the garden be more successful and understand how the plants actually want to move and behave and work with their kind of natural habits rather than fighting it. While this is a beautiful wow for the public, a stunning feature, it's simply not realistic or long lasting, because with the salvia being, growing in clumps, a lot of different plants can get in around them, weeds, and then after the bloom, there's kind of a sort of empty zone. So over time, the horticulturists have added plant species and started to diversify that area. This is just an example of how a design evolves over time to make sense for management and also longevity of the space. So Echinacea were incorporated into the space, as well as Sporobolus, Monarda, and Schizacherium, to create a more effective design. Contrasting to those plants that are in groups and blocks, we have areas where the plants are designed and they're intermingled or more matrix level design. This brings a level of complexity to the garden. It's very exciting, but does require a bit more attentive management of the space. And when I say that, I mean editing or removing plants that have become too much or the population has grown to be too large. And that is part of one of my main jobs, is to constantly assess the balance and the flow of the garden. Here's an example of a successful intermingling plant design in a corner of the garden with the Agastache, Echinacea, Parthenium, Amsonia, and Panicum. And what we've learned, and through Pete's design and our own experimentation, is really the key that grasses provide. They are truly the structure, the base of the whole design, and hold it together. Without them, it might feel a little too messy. So having the Panicum and the Amsonia in there provides a base to the design, and the Agastache and the Echinacea and the Parthenium bring that excitement and the variety of flower shapes. Here's another example of a well intermingled design. The digitalis is a biennial that seeds around, and we do have to control it somewhat, and just removing where it has spread too far, become too much. Generally, we don't deadhead at all in the garden. We do not remove spent flowers, and that is part of the aesthetic. We want to see that spent flower and also leave the seeds for the wildlife as well. And then an additional tactic that we take is using a single species to just dot throughout the garden, such as this gentiana. It is throughout one side of the garden, just popping up here and there in a variety of areas, providing that excitement and interest and filling little niches. We are constantly trying to cover the ground with more plants. You think that even with 340 some species, there'd be no room left on the ground, but we're always finding space to add more plants and provide that, create a succession of plants. I mentioned the hedge providing that framework for the garden, and there are a lot of components to Lurie Garden that are contradictory. While we are focused on having plants that can withstand drought, that are native, that provide ecosystem services. We also have this hedge that is highly resource intensive. So along the south and west border, this was some hedging that was converted into what is known as the bird border. It's a mix of native species that serve birds through providing nesting opportunities or food as well. So we are finding ways to have a formal design, yet start inching it closer to a more ecologically focused design. And some of the species are a little too successful, which we, again, are trialing, such as the Sambucus. It has started to take over. And when you're working in such a small space, while this is a wonderful native plant, it reduces our diversity in that area. So we're constantly kind of assessing the different species and how they're working within the design and making choices. Do we keep it? Do we swap it out for 5 different new native species because it's taking up so much space? Again, I mentioned, this is an all-season garden, and it's very common still amongst people who are caring for their gardens to cut them back in the fall and lay mulch over their garden beds and have a complete flat landscape through the winter. But we show that there is interest even in that winter season when you leave your plants up, because they have these beautiful, interesting structures and a kaleidoscope of colors, albeit, restricted to browns and blacks and grays. And we also are encouraging people to see this as beautiful, but also providing a service to wildlife as well. And a little more about wildlife, we see a variety of birds in the garden as we are along a migratory path. We've also seen some higher level predators in the garden. We've had foxes make their home in the garden. I've seen a coyote. And when I've looked at their diet, and they're eating, small rodents, birds, not trash or anything like that. So it is a sign that based on their diet, we do have a successful ecosystem that we're forming in this pocket in the middle of downtown Chicago. One last item that we are really trying to show the public and talk a lot about is how we do our cutback in the spring. And while this pertains specifically to our climate, we cut back our garden, the perennials, in late winter, early spring. But over the years, we've learned there are certain plant species that provide habitat for stem nesting bees. So we've worked out areas where we can do a higher cut on those and leave that space for the bees. So we're not just doing a complete cutback throughout the garden. And you can see here the old stems from the previous years, plus that next year's stems that do provide habitat for the specific stem nesting bees. So we see ourselves as an example for the public, and we try to educate and share what we learn each year while we constantly refine our tactics within the garden. So that's just a brief overview of Lurie Garden, and please feel free to look us up on our website, follow us on social media, and of course, visit if you're in Chicago.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. If I could ask you to stay on, the garden is just beautiful. I have never seen it in person, but the pictures are wonderful, and I like how you're using it as a focus to be able to share ecosystem and biodiversity planting, that it is possible with beautiful design and for all 4 seasons. So I would ask Elisa if you would also join us, and we can go to questions. And oh, right, perfect. I don't see any yet, but I did have a question. And I was wondering what trends you might expect to see in urban planting in the future. Kathryn, can I start with you?
Sure. And we are definitely seeing more of our native plants becoming regularly available to the public in retail. So I've noticed that people are looking to add natives to their garden, convert their lawns to garden areas. That is definitely a trend. And Elisa, I was definitely sympathizing that it's hard for people to get their native plants in your area. We are lucky that certain designers like P. Oudolf have actually, funnily enough, even though he's Dutch, have popularized North American natives, which has really been a service for us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as well, we're starting to see people more concerned about climate change and having this need now to select species that will cope, with the different climatic changes we're facing. So we are much more aware of what's requirement of the plant as well. What Kathryn was saying, like their whole life and not just a particular stage, and kind of like plant with more awareness of for biodiversity, what are the steps that we have to take?
So it's definitely and how do you think that going forward in the future, that are you thinking now about the next wave of climate change as the climate changes? Are you starting to plan for that now? Alicia?
So thank you. Yeah, so for example, in Mexico, we are starting to look at different how our species are distributed and how some cope better with drought. I think the tricky thing is how some species have that flexibility and that um, ability, plasticity to cope with extreme weathers. And we're seeing people doing research in that as well in here. And it's sad to say, but now as well being more open to non-native species. And that doesn't mean from other countries, but from other regions within our countries, because the way the climate is going to move is going to force us to actually see that probably plants that are in higher altitude will work better, or a lower altitude will work better in different places.
Kathryn, did you want to add to that?
I don't have anything particularly extra to add, but I do know like Chicago Botanic Garden, where I worked previously, and other institutions such as that are seed collecting in climates, just south of us, and testing some of those species in our climates to see how they fare through our winters. And ourselves in the gardens, we are pushing the limits. It's always good to experiment and try something that might test the limits of our zones just to see how it works. And certainly we have had different species over the years where they don't work for a number of reasons, whether it's climate related or, what have you, but we're kind of tracking that more loosely, I would say.
Super, thanks. And we do have some questions from the audience. So for you, Kathryn, how many people visit the garden in a year?
Oh, good question. It's hard to track because we get a lot of people passing through. I think it's about 1 million, I would say, somewhere in there. I'm not sure specifically, but over the course of the year, we do see in the millions.
Excellent. And another question for you. Was Lurie Park conceived from the start as a sort of experimental patch of land for testing out ornamental and native species, or did it evolve from a static garden design, of which most gardens start out at the beginning?
My interpretation, which, I can't speak for Pete himself, but my interpretation is that it starts with a static design, but he as a designer understands that gardens do evolve. And the wonderful thing is that this garden has always had a dedicated horticulturist or gardeners caring for it. And again, as I mentioned, while I was talking, the continued involvement of the designers. So he comes back every other year, every year, pretty regularly. So there's this constant dialogue between designer and gardener, which really facilitates that evolution of the garden. I've worked in other design spaces where they are much more static, but I do think overall we're really collectively seeing the design as the beginning, not, the culmination of anything. It's the beginning of something more.
And then along the resilience theme, so Elisa, if you could start with this, and Kathryn, when planning for resilient urban planting, how much inspiration can we realistically take from regions already experiencing challenging weather conditions, such as drought, but also flooding?
Well, I think that's actually where we have to come together as a team, because we are all experiencing these difficulties. And for example, we can see in Spain, they're doing a lot of different things to be able to have cooler cities and to be able to have more herbaceous, for example, under the trees that give pollinators a way to have food and shelter, so I think forums like these are amazing, because then we can learn from each other. And yes, definitely seeing all the case studies actually help us to reinvent ways to apply in our localities.
I
And
think
Kathryn,
Elisa said it perfectly.
yeah, she definitely did. So for Kathryn, it's a comment and a question. I very much appreciate Kathryn's discussions about the time dimension. In light of the pace of climate change, what time frame would you recommend for planned change over time when designing such gardens, and how much should one adopt a find out as we go approach?
So how do we plan for evolving the garden? Is that the question, essentially?
That's basically the question, right?
Okay. I think planning for that early on, what I often see as someone who is caring for a design space is there's a rush to have this finished look immediately. So often, trees are planted incredibly close together just to have it feel full. And I would really encourage designers to think about it more as a phased approach, as well as there's certain species that in order to get a higher diversity of plants working together, oftentimes you can't start with all of those plants together from the start. So planning, down the line, you might add in additional species as you go, as things settle in and have time to get established. Otherwise, one more aggressive species might just completely outcompete the other ones. It's hard to ask this of every project, but designers visiting the gardens again. And also I think one of the biggest keys to our success is we have funding to support this evolution of the garden. We have a budget to buy plants each year to adapt the garden and make changes where needed, because you can't, if you remove something that's not doing well, or even when you're weeding, you create this empty space, and you need to have, the funds to fill it again and try something new. So I think it is a combination of, it would be interesting to start to see designs presented as phased projects almost, and also to be really thinking about how those gardens are managed, because I'm in Lurie Garden, 5 days a week, which is much different than a garden that's cared for by a contracted service that visits once a week. So I think also designing for the level of management is really important.
It definitely is one of the most challenging things, is the ongoing maintenance. And yes, the botanical garden, you have the privilege of having that support, but it's not often always the case in municipal parks, etc. Elisa, did you want to add to that thought?
Well, I think that point of management and maintenance is a very good one. And what you were saying, allow the garden to grow. Sometimes as well, we have clients that want everything mature. And buying mature trees or putting mature trees will have a different evolution, and they weren't established as well as young trees. And sometimes you cannot do that in a public space. Sometimes you have to have a little bit of both. But as well, yeah, thinking that it's not something that is just going to pop up and be green and be perfect, that it's going to change. And I think we're seeing more acceptance of this change, and like gardens like this one is showing us, that we have to work with time. So yeah.
Exactly. And another question, actually, for Kathryn, have you had to remove any native species because they've been too aggressive and therefore a maintenance issue?
Yeah, that is definitely a consideration. The Tradescantia spiderwort became in excess, so we have removed that from the design. Currently, the Sambucus that I was mentioning in the presentation earlier, that is one where it is outcompeting the other shrubs in that bird border area, and it's just too successful. It's not that it's, a bad plant, but just in terms of design, it is limiting the diversity in the area. There's there's also the Virginia waterleaf, Hydrophyllum virginiana, that has been spreading quite a bit, but we are able to find kind of new spots for things and repurpose plants as well, rather than just completely kind of getting rid of them a lot of times. But that is a consideration because we do have some natives that are just too successful.
Thanks. And a very important question for Elisa. Have there been a successful program during your research in incentivizing local nurseries and propagators to focus on and produce natives and endemic ornamentals so that these plant materials will be available for future use? And also, is there a worldwide program where interested groups can apply for support? And I know it's a challenge definitely in Toronto, and I'm sure other cities, to obtain native material, a good source of them.
They are. So for example, the UNAM, the Autonomous University in Mexico, they have an amazing program of propagating and showing propagation in the towns of cacti and crassulaceae species. We have little nurseries like the one I work with, that is Paraíso Colibri, and they work with local small nurseries, and they do a network. So they share seeds, and then they share plants when they're big, you know, big projects. So they are that there's some that are, for example, in the more in tropical areas and rainforests. They have, but anyway, they're a little bit isolated. So they're good examples and good case studies, but we need much more about them. That doing lots of things as well. For example, in Brazil, in with the Cerrado, so they exist. I don't know if there is a worldwide program. I know, of different beats, but it would be excellent to have like a worldwide program of native projects.
Thanks. And Kathryn, did you have anything to add to that in terms of sourcing material?
I don't think so. No.
You have nurseries on site, I assume, that you grow.
We use local growers. We have a number of people that we rely on and have formed relationships with, and I think, that it's been very valuable to, know your grower, as a gardener, to establish those relationships, and then also, particularly when we're choosing native species, understanding, is this grower using local ecotypes or not? Are they responsibly, acquiring these plants, particularly with like certain spring ephemerals that have been historically harvested, illegally. So we're very fortunate in this area to have a number of very reliable and respected growers.
Thanks. And we have time for one final question that I see here in the chat, and that is, sorry, have you experienced vandalism in your parks?
Yes. We do deal with the hardscape materials being vandalized with graffiti or scratching, like carving in. One, I would say, actually, we have wooden benches, but they're an Ipe wood that was chosen a long time ago. But it is a very hard wood, which is resistant to a lot. I would say the ways we deal with that are, one, we do have signage up that talks about the space and sort of tells people that this is kind of a special place that is cared for. And we do try to keep everything maintained to a high standard, picking up trash, keeping the hardscape neat. And I feel like those cues of care tell people, you know, like this is a place to be respected. So we don't have a ton of issues. Honestly, though, the biggest probably help, and it's sort of unfortunate, is we have security in the park that constantly move through the space. And you know, they try to take a very kind of more laid back approach or respectful approach, but the security does make a difference.
Actually, we just got one great question in. I think it would be great to squeeze it in. Elisa, if I could ask you to answer this first. How significant is the evolution of microbial life in such gardens over time? And is this evolution tweaked by the gardeners to provide desired conditions of the garden?
Okay, nice question. Well, yeah, I suppose how significant evolution of microbial life in such gardens over time. I suppose there are lots of studies looking at that, or not that many, I don't know. But it's definitely changing all the time, isn't it? When we put more green matter compost, we're changing that microbial composition and densities. And if we're putting lots of pesticides, we're killing it. So definitely there's all the time the way we interact with our soils is going to change it. So let's use less pesticides and less herbicides, and let's try to garden in a much greener way, I suppose. And let's lots of doing lots of breaking down the soil.
Thanks, Kathryn. A final word?
I agree wholeheartedly. Less herbicides, less pesticides. That is an approach we take. And yeah, and also just, you know, being comfortable with that sort of natural progression of the garden, and, you know, realizing that having bugs eating your plants, it's okay.
Right, just acceptance. Well, thank you both so much for joining today. And I know I learned so much today, and I'm sure that the others who attended did as well. So thank you for your time, and we'll sign off the Q&A and turn it over to Francis to sign us off.
Thank you very much, Jane. And thank you for joining us today for this AIPH Green City Briefing. We have heard just how incredibly important it is to engage with the power of plants and urban species, and what a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for your questions and contributions. I would like to thank our speakers, Lisa and Kathryn, and to our MC, Jane, for the fantastic insights and inspirational conversation. Thank you very much. To you, the audience, thank you for joining us today, and do be sure to join us for the rest of the briefing series. This session has been recorded and will be available on the AIPH YouTube channel shortly, so please do share it with your colleagues. Finally, I'd like to thank once again our sponsors of the briefing series, the Worshipful Company of Gardeners. Until next time, thank you, and goodbye from me and the AIPH Green City team.